Hey there. Welcome to this Q&A video. In this one, I'm going to try and briefly cover a question I get a lot with folks who think they want to move up from a smartphone and maybe get a different type of camera. And the question is, what kind of camera should I get? And the answer real quickly is, I don't know. That's going to be up to you. It's going to depend on your needs and your wants and your desires in taking pictures. But what I can tell you, or what I think will help, is I can give you some background and I will tell you about some features, functions, and things you should be looking for in a camera, and make you aware of some things about cameras that hopefully will prevent you from making any critical mistakes as you venture down this rabbit hole that can be photography. So without any further ado, let's get on to the question I get a lot is, what kind of camera should I get?
Battalion 2, engines, 11, 27, 7, and 22, Investigator 1, Ladder 27, and Safety 1, House Fire, CO1 Maple Street, Army, Echo, Battalion 2, engines, 11, 27.
So you've decided you want to get a better camera, and you've started looking into cameras, and you find yourself overwhelmed with the choices and options out there, and that's to be expected. There are a lot. So as you get going on down this venture, a couple of things you need to consider. First of all is, what kind of camera do you want? Do you want just a better point and shoot, which again, take good pictures, tend to have a little bit larger sensor, and may give you a little optical variance, if you will, over your smartphone, or do you want to get something, a basic intro DSLR or mirrorless camera, or all in on going with a fully professional setup? Those are decisions you're going to have to make, and really it depends on where you think this is going to take you. So you're going to need to consider that. A couple of little tips that are really important when you start looking at, or you're thinking about jumping into this. First thing I will tell you is that things like lenses and flashes are typically specific to the camera manufacturer. So if you're going to get a good DSLR or mirrorless camera, if you're going to buy a Sony camera, you can't put a Canon lens on it. It won't work. So as you start researching this, look at those things, look at the available options. Do they have the lenses you might want? Do they have the flashes you think you're going to need? That stuff, it's all what they refer to as dedicated. Sometimes you can use adapters and things like that, but if you want the lens to work the way the manufacturer says it's going to work, it needs to be on the proper type of cameras. There are some third-party lens manufacturers that make lenses for the different manufacturers, and you just need to be sure you're buying the right one. So if you're buying a Viltrox or a Tamron lens, make sure that lens is set up for your particular brand of camera. And it's usually pretty clearly marked on the box. There you go. There's a Viltrox lens set up for a Fujifilm camera. Like I said, they'll make that for several different camera manufacturers. My other quick tip before you get into this is it's more than just a camera. You're going to need some accessories, and I would tell you probably don't skimp on the accessories. Big thing is memory cards. You got to have a memory card. Buy decent quality memory cards. You don't have to go get the best, but buy good quality memory cards and buy them from a reputable source. If you're buying stuff online, make sure you're not getting some knockoff. They tend not to work as well, and there is nothing as frustrating as having a memory card failure when you've taken 1,000 pictures and suddenly everything on it is corrupt. So pay attention to your memory card. Same thing with batteries. If you're getting a rechargeable battery for your camera, recommend you get the manufacturers. Again, there are third-party battery manufacturers out there that'll make batteries that fit and work, but they don't tend to work as well or stay as charged as long. So, buy yourself a couple of batteries, but get what the manufacturer recommends for putting in the camera. The next thing you need to think about with your camera choices is your budget. And again, you can spend as little or as much as you want, and there are ways to work around that. But, if you're going to go with something with an interchangeable lens, which is what my recommendation would be, you're up into several $100s right from the start. There are still options for you, but understand that you typically get what you pay for in photography. And so better quality lenses, better quality cameras cost more money. So consider that. You can get a point and shoot camera. Again, not my first recommendation or first choice, just because of the limited lenses. That's typically a fixed lens, and you can't change that. Getting an interchangeable lens camera will down the road pay a lot of dividends, where you can change lenses to specifically where your situation is and what you're trying to photograph. And then the final thought on price. Right now, the newest technology is mirrorless, and most of the major camera manufacturers are moving to mirrorless cameras. So they tend to be a little bit more expensive. But what that does mean is you can find older DSLR cameras, and DSLR cameras are really just the old SLR cameras from the film days that they have retrofitted, and I don't want to sound like they forced it, but it's just the old design has been upgraded to allow for digital photography, but they still use the mirror that flips up out of the way. That's typically the clicking you hear when you take a picture with a DSLR. But the nice thing about that is, again, some of those cameras are really good. Some of the manufacturers are still producing really good quality cameras, but because they're not the newest technology, a lot of times you can find those for a little less money. And then my other thought is, if you're buying anything, is consider buying used equipment. Once again, buy it from a reputable dealer. There's camera stores in Charlotte you can go down to, and they'll have a selection of used cameras. There's a lot of online sellers, but again, I would look at some of the major sellers and see what they have that's available, which you can typically find some pretty good deals. I will say, for used equipment, like a lot of things nowadays, the prices are going to be pretty standard. So whatever you're looking for, you're not going to find a lot of variability between different websites and different camera stores. They're all priced about the same. They all know sort of what they're worth. If everyone's got a camera that you want to get and it's $1,000, and you continue searching to find one where it's $500, if you do, I would be concerned and wonder why it was $500, because again, those prices are pretty standard. One of the ways you can find cheaper equipment is what they call gray market equipment. And again, gray market is typically equipment that wasn't made for sale in the US. Again, most of these manufacturers are based overseas anyhow. So they'll sell different cameras or different setups for their cameras in different countries. And lots of times you can find them here, and they may or may not meet your needs. But if you ever have a problem with them, what you're going to find out is the manufacturers typically won't do any work on them or warranty them if they're gray market. So just be aware of that. A lot of the sellers will tell you that. Online sellers will mention that, this wasn't built for sale in the US. So just be aware of that. If you buy that camera, it may function different, may have some different features, and more importantly, it may be something that the manufacturer isn't willing to work with. So keep that in mind. So you're decided you're going to get an interchangeable lens camera, and you've started looking at them. What is the difference between a $800 camera and a $2,000 camera? And typically it's going to be features and functions that the camera has. So you're going to have to look at those and decide what's going to be important to you. What do you need? What do you want in your camera to help you make that best decision? So just to go over a couple of things you should look at, let's consider some of the differences you're going to find as camera prices change. DSLR versus mirrorless. I've already talked a little bit about this. DSLR is the old style camera. It's got the mirror in front, so the image is coming through the lens, projected on the mirror up through the eyepiece, and then that flips up out of the way, which used to expose the film, now exposes the digital sensor. Mirrorless is a little different. Typically, if you have a viewfinder on a mirrorless, you're not actually looking at what the lens is seeing. You're looking at a little tiny screen, a little TV screen. It has some advantages. In one, it's kind of a what you see is what you get. So you know how your photo's composed. You know what it's going to look like. And you can check things like exposure levels. You'll see that right there. It has sort of the less moving parts. It still obviously has a shutter, but it doesn't have that mechanism that requires the mirror to move out of the way. So that makes it hopefully more reliable, and can make it a little quieter. Like I said, the mirrors flipping up and out of the way can be pretty noisy, depending on where you're at and what you want to take pictures of. So decide that first. Do I want DSLR or do I want mirrorless? Some other features, a lot of cameras, the newer cameras now have an IBIS or OIS, which is basically an image stabilization process. Some of the cameras have them. A lot of new lenses will have them. And what those are designed to do is eliminate camera shake, especially at slow shutter speeds. So consider that depending on the shutter speed you're going to be using. As your shutter speed gets faster and faster, that's not typically going to be an issue. But if you're working with slow shutter speeds, like you might be in low light, having some kind of image stabilization would really be helpful. So consider that. Autofocus. Nowadays, all the cameras have autofocuses. They've gotten pretty good. There are probably some that are still better than others, but they're all pretty decent. And autofocuses have a lot of options now. My camera, I can set up to autofocus on faces, on eyes, on left eye, on right eye. I can pick single points. I can pick a large area. That's pretty standard. So look at the autofocus options. And you may want to look at how well the autofocus works, depending on what you're trying to photograph. If you're photographing sports or wildlife, something outdoors, having a good autofocus is really going to be important. Frames per second, or the number of pictures you can set your camera to take with a single press of the shutter. Typically, you push the shutter button down, it takes one picture. But today's cameras, you can set them up so they're taking bursts. And that burst can be anywhere from 3 photographs a second up to 8 to 10 to 12 photographs a second, and even more. Obviously, that requires power, and that changes some of the dynamics. The faster you shoot photographs, the slower your camera is going to be, especially if you run into buffering as it's copying those to the memory card. But having the camera set up on a burst is kind of handy, especially for action photography outdoors. You don't have to time the single shot. Just start taking the picture, and when you get back, find the one you want, if you will. So look at the frame rates. And again, today everything will do 3 to 8 to 12, but there are cameras today that'll capture 40 frames in a second. And if you want to get a picture of a baseball hitting a bat, you might need that kind of frame rate. So consider the frame rate that's possible on your camera. Dynamic range. Dynamic range simply refers to the spread of how light and how dark you can get. And a lot of cameras can sort of boost that. Unlike the human eye, which is really good at discerning all those, cameras tend to narrow down. So a lot of them have introduced sort of high dynamic range so that they can try and compensate, so they can see the darks and the lights the same way that people can. So look at the dynamic range options for a camera. Memory cards. I've talked a little bit about memory cards, but think about memory card slots. How many do you want? Professional cameras typically have 2 slots, gives you a little redundancy, a little backup in case you have a problem with it. Sometimes people set them up so that one slot is capturing images, the other is capturing movies. But I would consider, if it's possible and what you're looking at, getting a camera with 2 memory slots. And then there's other options as you go on down the line, everything from GPS tagging. Those are the things that are going to change the price of the camera. So when you're looking at a camera manufacturer and you think, well, they got an $800 camera and they got a $3,000 camera, what's the difference? It's probably in that list of features. The big one is probably going to be the sensor size. Sensor size basically refers to how many megapixels your camera is capturing, and it stands to reason that the more megapixels, the more detailed your photo is going to be. Not always true. There are things you can do to work around that, but that's another thing you're going to see. So consider the sensor size of your camera. So all that goes into your decision making. Again, especially if you're just getting started, consider buying used equipment, especially the older technology. It's out there, it's pretty easy to find, and it's relatively inexpensive. If you're going to do that, I would still recommend you sort of figure out where you might want to be down the road, especially when it comes to brands. So if you're going to buy an inexpensive Canon camera, but down the road you want to get a better camera, make sure you're happy with the Canon cameras and lenses that are available. Again, lenses and cameras don't necessarily interchange. So, if you've got a really great Sony lens and you had a cheap Canon camera, they're not going to work. So try and figure that out before you get going and buying stuff. So buy your Canon camera, but make sure that any lenses you get are going to be compatible with that. And then, down the road, if you decide you want another camera, hopefully Canon makes one that you like. So think about the brand and where you're going to go with that when it comes to that. Some other things to think about with your camera. The video capabilities. Do you want to be able to take video? Some manufacturers are better at video. And if you want to have video, then keep that in mind. Look at the video specs. Make sure you can get, your 4K, 8K, 1080p, whatever it is you want to shoot, that you can capture the video that you want that's going to be most effective for you. Again, some of the manufacturers are now building cameras that are really more video focused. They'll take still images, but they're really designed to take good video. Do you need a viewfinder? Especially some of the less expensive cameras don't have a viewfinder. They just have a screen on the back that helps you compose. A lot of point and shoots will have that. Makes it a little easier. You can hold the camera out in front of you and compose your picture. For example, this is an old Nikon Coolpix. It doesn't have a viewfinder, but it does have a screen that you can compose it with. So when you're taking a picture, you're looking at the screen. Those work fairly well. They don't always work great outdoors when there's bright light, so that's something to think about. So you may want a camera with a viewfinder so you can actually bring it up to your eye to take your picture, and you don't have to worry about the sun reflecting on your screen to get rid of it. But obviously viewfinders and screens on the back, that becomes two screens. That's going to increase the cost of your camera. Crop sensor versus full-size sensors. This one, you'll hear a lot of people talk about it, how important it is to have a full-size sensor. I'm not sure I agree with that. Basically, when we're talking about a full-size sensor, we're going back to the film days, and back when we used 35 millimeter film. The 35 millimeter film had a standard size, and so when we moved over to digital, basically a sensor that is the same size as a 35 millimeter film negative was considered full frame. Obviously, the bigger the sensor, the more the cost, and so some camera manufacturers introduced sensors that were a little bit smaller, and you'll hear those referred to as crop sensor. Again, it is really about the pixels and the density of pixels in your sensor, but that does change some things. There is a standard crop that a lot of manufacturers use. Fuji uses, Nikon uses, and that's basically a half. There's a micro 4/3, and that actually changes the size of the sensor, and it typically is well suited for social media, so that's something to think about also. But either way, consider where you're at and where you want to be down the road. You know, you can buy a crop sensor camera, but if you think at some point you're going to want a full sensor camera, you may want to make sure that you're staying within a brand, or that's even an option. Again, I'm a fan of Fujifilm cameras. They don't offer full-size sensors. They have the large format, which is a little different, and obviously that costs more, but all their cameras are crop sensors. I'm happy with them. They get the images I want. And again, a lot of it has to do with the pixel density, not necessarily the size of the sensor. But that is something you'll hear a lot, full-size sensor versus a crop sensor. Just as a fun fact, you know, the full-size sensor copies 35 millimeter film, but back when we were taking pictures with 35 millimeter film, that was considered small format film. You know, if you went to a wedding or a portrait photography, they were typically using a medium format film, which was typically the old 2x2s. You'll see the old Yashica Madison Veronica cameras had a negative that was 2 inches by 2 inches, or they're using a large format, and those are the old, like the Speed Graflex cameras, where it was literally a 4-inch by 5-inch negative. And it makes sense. The larger the negative, the more information you can capture. Full-size sensor now is equivalent to a 35 millimeter, and what we keep doing is packing more and more pixels into it so we can capture more detail. The sensor size does affect some other things. It affects its ability to capture low light and things like that. So consider, you know, what size sensor you're going to want and where you think you're going to be down the road with it. Manual controls. I strongly recommend you get a camera that you can use and set up to operate manually. Nothing against using the automatic controls of the camera. They're pretty good. They work on a, you know, they understand sort of the typical format. That's what your phone does when you take a picture. But as you get better, you may want to have the ability to manually control those. So I'm talking about being able to control the shutter, the aperture, the ISO. Having control over that will give you more control over the photos you take, and you may like the results more. So certainly nothing wrong with walking out, putting your camera on automatic and taking pictures, but consider that. Most cameras now have a fully auto setting, but they also have a couple of others. They'll have like a shutter priority and an aperture priority. And in those, you set either the shutter or the aperture, and then the camera compensates to get you a properly exposed photograph. So if you know you want to take pictures of something that's moving fast, you're going to need a fast shutter speed. You can manually set a thousandth or 2,000ths of a shutter speed, and the camera will figure out the appropriate aperture and ISO settings. So that can be handy. But at some point, you're probably going to want to be able to take manual photographs. So make sure that your camera has that option or that capability. Okay, so that's it for figuring out sort of the features and functions of your camera and what you need to consider when you're considering buying a new camera. Hopefully this video was helpful. I will do more in the future. We might even get a little more specific, where we'll talk about brands and cameras and makes and lenses and things like that. But that's just some of the things you need to consider and think about before you jump in and spend $1,000 on a camera. Hate to see you go spend $1,000 and then figure out, you know, the lenses you want aren't available, or the technology is not doing what you wanted it to do. So once again, do your research. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Hopefully you enjoyed this and found this helpful, and we'll just see you in the next Q&A video. Bye.